John Whitmore sat on the edge of his small wooden chair, holding a letter in his rough, wrinkled hands. His eyes slowly moved across the words printed on the paper. It was a court summons. He was being charged for running a red light. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he placed the letter on the old kitchen table. The dim light in his modest home flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't angry or upset. He wasn't even surprised. He had seen the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror that day, and he knew what was coming. The police officer had been polite but firm, handing him a ticket without much conversation. John hadn't argued. He never did. That wasn't the kind of man he was. John was 76 years old, a veteran who had served his country long ago. His body bore the marks of time and hardship. His back ached, his hands shook slightly, and his knees complained with every step. But his mind was still sharp, and his heart was still full of quiet dignity. Life hadn't been easy after the war, but he had managed. He had worked hard, raised a family, and done his best to live honestly. His old pickup truck, the same one he had driven for over 20 years, was the reason he had run the red light. The brakes had been failing for weeks, and though he knew they needed fixing, he simply couldn't afford it. His military pension covered just enough: food, rent, and the basic bills. There was nothing left for expensive car repairs. The truck had been slowing down as he approached the intersection, but the brakes didn't catch in time. He had rolled through the red light before coming to a full stop. No one was hurt. No accident had occurred. But the law was the law, and he had broken it. Now he had to appear in court. John rubbed his tired eyes and stood up, walking toward the small window in his kitchen. He looked outside at the quiet street. It was early morning, and the world was just waking up. The birds were chirping in the trees, and a few neighbors were stepping out of their homes, starting their day. He used to wake up before sunrise every day, back when he was young and strong. Now, every movement took effort. He turned away from the window and picked up his jacket, the same military-issued jacket he had worn for decades. It was old and faded, but he still kept it clean and neat. He placed it over his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of it. As he walked toward the door, he glanced at a framed picture hanging on the wall. It was a photograph from his younger days, taken during his time in the service. He stood tall in the image, surrounded by fellow soldiers, his uniform crisp, his eyes full of determination. He had been a different man then, faster, stronger, ready to face anything. He had seen things that no one should have to see, survived situations that should have been impossible. And yet, after all these years, he was about to stand before a judge, not for something heroic, not for something meaningful, but for crossing a red light. He shook his head, a small, tired smile appearing on his face. Life had a strange sense of humor. He stepped outside, locking his door behind him, and slowly made his way to his truck. The old engine rumbled as he started it, coughing before settling into a low growl. He placed both hands on the wheel, his fingers tightening slightly. The courthouse wasn't far, but the drive felt longer than usual. His mind drifted as he watched the town pass by. He had lived here for most of his life. He had watched the streets change, new buildings rise, old ones disappear. He had seen children grow up, start families of their own. And yet, despite all the changes, he had remained the same old soldier, carrying memories that no one asked about anymore. When he arrived at the courthouse, he parked carefully and sat in his truck for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't nervous, but he wasn't exactly comfortable either. He had faced battles before, stood before commanding officers, made life and death decisions. But this was different. This was just a simple legal matter, one that could result in a fine, maybe even a harsher punishment if the judge was strict. John finally took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck, and walked toward the courthouse doors. His boots clicked against the pavement with each slow, steady step. Whatever happened inside that courtroom, he would handle it the way he always had, with quiet strength and dignity. He had no idea that his presence in that courtroom was about to change everything. John Whitmore woke up early that morning, just as he always did. Even at his age, his body followed the same routine it had for years. He made himself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the quiet street outside. The world had changed so much, yet, in many ways, it felt the same. Today, however, was different. Today, he had to go to court. His old hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work, rested on the summons letter sitting on the kitchen table. He had read it many times already. The words were simple. He was being charged for running a red light. He had never been in trouble before, not in his entire life. He had lived by the law, respected the rules, and always tried to do the right thing. But that day, when the light turned red, he had no choice. He sighed and took another sip of coffee. His truck, an old battered vehicle he had driven for nearly 2 decades, had been giving him trouble. The brakes weren't what they used to be. He had meant to get them fixed, but repairs were expensive. His pension covered just enough for rent, food, and a few other necessities. There was never anything left for luxuries, certainly not for costly truck repairs. That day, as he had been driving home from the grocery store, the light at the intersection turned red faster than he expected. He pressed the brakes, but the truck didn't stop in time. He rolled past the light, barely making it across before the traffic from the other direction moved forward. He had hoped no one noticed, but apparently, a traffic camera had caught everything. Now, here he was, an 82-year-old man, about to stand in court like some kind of criminal. John finished his coffee, got dressed, and put on the one thing that had always given him strength, his old military jacket. It was worn, faded, and slightly torn in a few places, but it carried his history. It reminded him of the years he had served, the sacrifices he had made, and the men he had fought beside. It reminded him that he had once been strong, and even now, he refused to let age make him weak. He took his cane, stepped out of his small house, and walked slowly toward his truck. The engine coughed before coming to life, and he pulled onto the road, making his way to the courthouse. As he drove, he thought about how things had changed over the years. Once upon a time, people respected veterans like him. They saw the uniform and nodded in gratitude. But now, he was just another old man in a courtroom. No one would care about his past. No one would know that he had once fought for the very freedom that allowed them to drive down these streets. When he arrived at the courthouse, he parked in the farthest corner of the lot. He didn't mind walking. It gave him time to think. He looked up at the tall building before him, took a deep breath, and slowly made his way inside. The hallways were busy. Lawyers in suits rushed from one room to another. People sat on benches, waiting for their hearings. Some were nervous, others angry. John simply found a seat near the back and waited for his turn. A young woman, possibly in her 30s, sat next to him. She glanced at his jacket and hesitated before speaking. "Excuse me, sir, were you in the military?" John turned to her and gave a small nod. "A long time ago." "Thank you for your service," she said with a sincere smile. John nodded again, appreciating the words, even if they felt distant. Finally, his name was called. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the courtroom door. His heart pounded, though he wasn't sure why. He had faced worse things in life than a courtroom. Still, there was something unsettling about standing before a judge at this age. He stepped inside and saw the judge sitting at the bench, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes. His expression was unreadable as he glanced at the papers in front of him. John took his place, gripping his cane tightly. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was ready to accept whatever came next. And then something strange happened. The judge looked up, met John's eyes, and froze. His face changed, his stern expression suddenly softened, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. His eyes widened slightly as if he recognized something. John, unaware of what was going on, simply stood there, waiting. The courtroom was silent, and everyone seemed confused by the judge's reaction. Then, to everyone's shock, the judge's hands trembled and his eyes filled with tears. No one understood what was happening, but John was about to find out. John stood there, gripping his cane, wondering what had just happened. The judge, a man who had likely seen hundreds, if not thousands of cases, was staring at him as if he had seen a ghost. The courtroom had fallen silent, and everyone was watching the judge, waiting for him to speak. But he didn't. His lips parted slightly, and his hands trembled as he removed his glasses. John shifted slightly, confused. He had expected a quick and straightforward hearing. Just a fine, maybe a lecture, and then he'd go home. But this reaction was something he hadn't prepared for. The judge blinked a few times, swallowed hard, and leaned forward. His voice, when he finally spoke, was softer than before. "Please state your full name," he said. John cleared his throat. "John Whitmore." As soon as he said it, the judge let out a shaky breath and leaned back in his chair, pressing a hand to his forehead. A wave of emotion passed over his face, one that even he seemed to struggle to control. The courtroom murmured in confusion. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, then at John, trying to understand what was happening. John, still puzzled, looked at the judge closely. There was something familiar about him, but he couldn't quite place it. His features, though older, sparked a memory deep within John's mind. But it was distant, buried under decades of life. The judge took another deep breath, his voice barely steady. "Mr. Whitmore, do you remember serving in the war?" John frowned slightly. That was a question he hadn't expected. Of course, he remembered. It was impossible to forget. The long nights, the sound of gunfire, the faces of those he had fought beside. It was all still fresh in his mind, even after so many years. "Yes," he replied simply. "I do." The judge nodded slowly. His hands were still shaking slightly as he reached for the glass of water on his desk. He took a sip, then looked up again. His eyes were red, not from anger, but from something deeper, something personal. Do you remember a young soldier?" The judge continued. "He was injured, left behind during an ambush. Everyone thought he was dead, but someone went back for him." His voice broke slightly. Someone carried him through enemy fire, risking his own life to save him. John's breath caught in his throat. A memory, long buried, began to surface. It was a dark night in the middle of a war zone. Explosions lit up the sky, and gunfire echoed all around. The mission had gone wrong, and his unit was retreating. But as they pulled back, John had heard something, a faint cry for help. He had turned, searching through the chaos, and found a young soldier lying on the ground, blood soaking his uniform. His eyes were filled with fear, pain, and something else, desperation. The others had already moved ahead. There was no time, but John couldn't leave him. He had lifted the wounded soldier onto his back, carrying him through the gunfire, through the danger, refusing to let him die there. And now, standing in the middle of a courtroom, John finally understood. His eyes widened as he looked at the judge again, truly seeing him for the first time. The sharp features, the eyes filled with emotion. It was him, the soldier he had saved. The realization hit John like a wave. He had never known what happened to the young man after that night. Once they had reached safety, medics had taken him away, and John had returned to the battlefield. He had assumed the soldier had survived, but he had never expected to meet him again, let alone in a place like this. The judge's voice cracked. "That soldier was me, Mr. Whitmore." A gasp ran through the courtroom. Some people turned to each other, whispering in disbelief. The prosecutor stared at the judge, then back at John, realizing the gravity of what had just been revealed. John's lips parted, but no words came out. He had faced many things in his life, but this moment, this unexpected reunion, left him speechless. The judge wiped at his eyes quickly, trying to compose himself, but the emotion was too strong. "You saved my life," he whispered. "All these years, I never knew who you were. I never got to thank you." His voice broke again, and he shook his head. "And now you're standing here in my courtroom, being charged for something so small after everything you've done." Tears welled up in the judge's eyes again, and this time he didn't try to stop them. The strong, composed man who had spent years upholding the law now looked vulnerable, overcome with emotion. John finally found his voice. He spoke softly, humbly. "I was just doing what any soldier would do." The judge let out a short, shaky laugh. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You did more than that. You gave me a second chance at life." Silence hung in the air for a long moment. The weight of the past, the bond formed in the middle of war, had suddenly resurfaced in the most unexpected of places. The courtroom remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The judge sat there, looking at John with eyes full of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and something else, something deeper. The moment felt unreal, as if time had stopped, holding the past and present together in a way no one could have predicted. John, standing tall despite the weight of the years on his back, felt his grip tighten around his cane. He had never expected this day to turn into something so emotional. He had walked in expecting a simple court hearing, a fine, maybe some words from the judge about following traffic rules. Instead, he was staring into the eyes of a man he had once saved, a man who had once been just a scared young soldier lying helpless on the battlefield. The judge took a deep breath and sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face as if trying to process everything. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice softer now, almost unsteady. "I remember that night," the judge said, his eyes never leaving John's. "I remember thinking I wouldn't make it. The pain was unbearable. The fear." He stopped, shaking his head. "And then, I felt someone lifting me. I couldn't see clearly, but I heard your voice. You told me to hold on. You told me I wasn't going to die there." John swallowed, memories of that night flashing in his mind. The cold air, the smell of smoke, the distant gunfire. He had been terrified too, but he couldn't leave that young soldier behind. He had carried him, step by step, through danger, refusing to let go even when exhaustion tried to take over. The judge took another shaky breath. "You carried me for miles. You didn't stop. You didn't leave me, even when you could have." He blinked rapidly, his voice breaking. "You saved my life, Mr. Whitmore, and I never got to thank you." John remained silent for a moment before finally speaking, his voice calm and steady. "I didn't do it for thanks, son. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The judge's lips pressed together, and he nodded slowly. His fingers tapped lightly on the wooden desk in front of him as he gathered his thoughts. Then his gaze shifted to the courtroom, where everyone sat frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Even the prosecutor looked unsure, as if he no longer knew whether this was just another case or something much bigger. Then the judge spoke again, louder this time, his voice carrying authority, but also deep emotion. "Let the record show that Mr. Whitmore is not just a defendant in this courtroom. He is a hero." A few quiet gasps echoed through the room. John, however, remained still. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He had simply done what any soldier would do, what any decent man would do. But looking at the judge now, seeing the deep gratitude in his eyes, John realized that to this man, he was more than just a veteran. He was the reason he was still alive. The judge took another deep breath and straightened his posture. "Mr. Whitmore," he said firmly, "you should not be standing here as a man facing charges. You should be standing here as a man this country owes a debt to." John shifted slightly, unsure of what to say. He had never wanted special treatment. He had never asked for anything in return for his service. He had simply done his duty and moved on. But hearing those words from the judge, words filled with sincerity, made something stir inside him. A sense of being seen, truly seen, after all these years. The judge turned toward the prosecutor. "I see no reason for this case to continue," he said. "This man does not deserve a fine. He does not deserve a punishment. He deserves our respect." The prosecutor, still looking slightly stunned, nodded slowly. I agree, Your Honor." John exhaled softly, relief washing over him, but not because the case was being dismissed. That wasn't what mattered to him. What mattered was that, after all these years, someone remembered. Someone cared. The judge wasn't finished. He looked back at John, and this time, his voice was personal, raw with emotion. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't know how to repay you for what you did that night, but I want you to know that I have never forgotten it, and I never will." John gave a small nod, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm just glad you made it, son." A deep silence followed, one filled with unspoken words and emotions too strong to express. But in that silence, something powerful passed between them, an unbreakable bond, formed in the middle of a war and now reunited in the most unexpected way. John had come to the courthouse expecting judgment. Instead, he had found gratitude, respect, and a reminder that the past never truly fades. Some acts of kindness, some moments of bravery, leave a mark that lasts forever. John stood there, his heart heavy with emotions he hadn't expected to feel today. The courtroom, once filled with routine cases and tired expressions, was now quiet, filled with a different kind of energy, one of deep respect and admiration. The judge took a deep breath, steadying himself as he wiped the last traces of tears from his eyes. He looked at John, his gaze full of something unspoken, something that couldn't be captured in just words. "I owe you my life, Mr. Whitmore," the judge said. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of everything he had just realized. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here today. I wouldn't have had the chance to grow up, to build a career, to have a family." John gave him a small nod, his expression calm but warm. "I'm glad you did," he said simply. The judge exhaled slowly, then turned toward the courtroom. "This case is dismissed," he announced firmly. "Mr. Whitmore is free to go." There was a brief silence as everyone processed his words. Then, one by one, quiet murmurs filled the room. Some people nodded in approval. Others exchanged looks of amazement. Even the prosecutor, who had initially been ready to present evidence against John, simply nodded in agreement. John, however, remained still. He had come in expecting to face a fine, maybe a short lecture about traffic rules. Instead, he had found something much greater, a moment of recognition that he hadn't even known he needed. The judge wasn't finished yet. He turned back to John and, with a deep breath, rose from his chair. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, he stepped down from the bench and walked toward John. John watched as the judge approached him. When the judge finally stood before him, he did something that left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. He saluted. It wasn't just a small, polite gesture. It was the kind of salute a soldier gives to someone they truly respect. The kind of salute that carries years of gratitude, honor, and deep appreciation. John's breath caught for a moment. It had been years since anyone had saluted him like that. Slowly, with the grace and discipline that had never left him, he lifted his own hand and returned the salute. The moment felt sacred. For a few seconds, there was nothing else. No courtroom, no case, no laws. Just two men, connected by a past that had shaped them both. The judge finally lowered his hand and spoke again, his voice softer now. "Please, let me do something for you," he said. "You've done more for me than I can ever repay." John hesitated. He had never been the kind of man to ask for favors. He had lived his life on his own, never expecting anything in return for his service. But before he could respond, the judge continued. "You said you couldn't fix your truck because repairs were too expensive," he said. "Consider it taken care of. I will personally make sure it's repaired at no cost to you." John's eyes widened slightly. He opened his mouth to protest, but the judge shook his head. "Please," he said, "this is not charity. This is gratitude. let me do this." John looked at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." The judge smiled, and for the first time since John had stepped into the courtroom, the tension in the air seemed to lift. But then, something unexpected happened. A man sitting at the back of the room suddenly stood up. He was middle-aged, wearing a simple suit, and had been silent the entire time. Now, he cleared his throat and stepped forward. "If I may," the man said, addressing the judge, "I'd like to offer something as well." The judge turned toward him curiously. "Go ahead." The man looked at John. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "I own a small diner a few blocks from here. My father was a veteran too. If you ever find yourself needing a warm meal, my place is always open to you. No charge, anytime." John blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected any of this. Another voice spoke up. This time, it was the young woman who had been sitting beside him earlier in the waiting area. "I work at the local community center," she said. "We have programs for veterans, including social events and support groups. If you ever need anything, we'd love to have you join us." One by one, more voices joined in. A lawyer mentioned that he helped veterans with legal paperwork for free. A mechanic offered to help maintain John's truck after the repairs. A woman in the back said she volunteered at a veterans hospital and would be happy to help if John ever needed medical assistance. John listened, his heart growing heavy with emotion. He had spent so many years thinking that people had forgotten, that his service, his sacrifices, had faded into the past, unnoticed by the world. But here, in this small courtroom, among strangers, he realized something. John walked out of the courthouse, his steps slow but steady. The air outside felt different, lighter, as if a burden he had been carrying for years had suddenly lifted. He had entered that courtroom expecting nothing more than a fine. Instead, he had walked out with something far more valuable: respect, kindness, and the realization that people still cared. As he reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, he noticed the judge standing nearby, waiting for him. The younger man had removed his robe, now dressed in a simple suit, making him look less like an authority figure and more like an old friend. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge called out, walking toward him. John turned, giving him a small nod. "Judge." The judge smiled. "Please, call me Daniel." John hesitated for a moment before nodding again. "All right, Daniel." There was a brief silence between them, not an awkward one, but one filled with meaning. "Would you let me take you to lunch?" Daniel asked. "I'd like to sit down with you, talk, if you don't mind." John glanced around. He wasn't used to people offering things like this. But after what had happened in the courtroom, he knew this was different. It wasn't pity. It was respect. "I'd like that," John said. Daniel smiled, relief evident in his eyes. "Great. There's a small diner not far from here. The one that man in the courtroom owns." John nodded. "Lead the way." As they walked, John noticed something strange. People were looking at him differently. A few had been in the courtroom and had recognized him. Some gave him small nods of respect. A young man even stepped forward and shook his hand. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said sincerely before walking off. John stood there for a moment, watching the young man disappear into the crowd. It had been a long time since anyone had said those words to him. When they reached the diner, the owner himself was waiting for them at the door. The moment he saw John, he grinned and extended his hand. "Mr. Whitmore," he said warmly, shaking his hand firmly. "Welcome. Your meal today is on the house." John felt a small smile tug at his lips. "I appreciate it," he said. They sat at a corner booth, and the owner personally took their orders. As they waited for their food, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I meant what I said in there," Daniel told him. "I spent years wondering who saved me that night. I thought about it all the time. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for you." John shook his head slightly. "I was just doing what I had to do," he said. "What any soldier would have done." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. No, not everyone would have done it. You went back for me when you didn't have to. You carried me for miles, even though it put your own life in danger. His voice softened. You gave me a second chance at life. John looked down at the table for a moment. He had spent so many years alone, never expecting any recognition for what he had done. But hearing those words from Daniel made him realize something. His actions had truly mattered. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few moments before Daniel spoke again. "Where do you live, John?" he asked. John took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Small house on the edge of town. Been there for years." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Do you have family nearby?" John hesitated before shaking his head. "Not really. Lost my wife a few years back. My son moved away for work. It's just me now." Daniel's expression softened. "I'm sorry." John waved a hand dismissively. "Life goes on." Daniel was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "Listen, John, I don't want today to be the last time we talk. I'd like to keep in touch. Maybe visit you sometimes, if you're all right with that." John was taken aback. He had gotten used to being forgotten, to spending his days alone. The idea that someone wanted to stay in touch, someone who owed him nothing but was still offering friendship, felt strange but good. After a moment, he nodded. "I'd like that," he admitted. Daniel smiled. "Good." As they finished their meal, John felt something inside him shift. He had spent years believing his best days were behind him, that no one remembered or cared about what he had done. But today had changed that. People still remembered. People still cared. And for the first time in a long time, John felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living again. John sat in the diner, finishing the last sip of his coffee. The warmth of the drink spread through him. But it wasn't just the coffee making him feel that way. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging. Daniel, the judge who had once been a wounded soldier in John's arms, sat across from him, still deep in thought. The conversation between them had flowed so naturally, as if they had known each other for years. And in a way they had, just not in the way either of them had expected. As John set his empty cup down, the owner of the diner approached them with a friendly smile. "Hope you enjoyed the meal, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "You're always welcome here." John nodded. "It was great. Thank you." The owner hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I meant what I said earlier. My father was a veteran. He passed a few years ago, but he always told me that men like you deserve to be remembered, not forgotten." John didn't know what to say. He had spent years thinking that the world had moved on without him, that his service had been just another story buried in history. But here was a stranger, someone who had never met him before today, offering him kindness simply because he understood what it meant to serve. The owner patted John's shoulder lightly before stepping away to attend to other customers. John glanced at Daniel. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. Daniel smiled. "You don't have to say anything." They sat there for a few more minutes before finally deciding to leave. As they stepped outside, the afternoon sun was shining bright, casting a golden glow over the street. John took a deep breath. "Guess I should head home," he said. Daniel nodded but hesitated before speaking. "John, do you have any plans for tomorrow?" John frowned slightly. "Tomorrow?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "There's a small gathering for veterans at the community center. The woman in the courtroom, the one who mentioned the support group, told me about it before she left. I was thinking, maybe we could go together." John hesitated. It had been years since he had attended anything like that. Most of the time, he kept to himself, not wanting to dwell on the past or talk about things that couldn't be changed. But today had been different. Today, people had reminded him that he wasn't invisible, that his story still mattered. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to step out of the shadows. After a long pause, John nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll go." Daniel grinned. Great. I'll pick you up in the morning. With that, they went their separate ways, but for the first time in a long time, John didn't feel alone as he walked toward his old truck. The repairs had already been arranged. Thanks to Daniel's insistence, John had tried to argue, but the judge wouldn't hear of it. Consider it a small token of appreciation, Daniel had said. John ran a hand over the truck's worn-out hood before climbing inside. The engine still groaned and sputtered, but it ran, and that was enough for now. As he drove home, he thought about everything that had happened in the past few hours. It was strange how life worked. One small moment, one unexpected meeting, had changed everything. When he reached his house, he parked the truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the quiet street. Then he made a decision. John got out of the truck, walked up the steps to his house, and pulled out an old wooden box from his closet. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were his medals, his service ribbons, and a few old photographs from his time in the military. He ran his fingers over the faded pictures, memories flooding back. For so long, he had locked this part of himself away, believing that no one cared, that his past no longer mattered. But today had proven him wrong. With careful hands, John placed one of the medals on the table, right where he could see it. Not as a reminder of war, but as a reminder of something else. Brotherhood, sacrifice, and the bonds that time could never break. Tomorrow, he would take a step forward. And for the first time in years, he looked forward to what the next day would bring. The morning sun shone softly through John's window, casting a golden glow across the small room. He had woken up earlier than usual, but today, he didn't mind. Today felt different. For the first time in years, he had something to look forward to. He got out of bed, stretched his aching joints, and walked to the bathroom. As he washed his face, he looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him was older, his face lined with years of experience. But his eyes held something new today, a spark that had been missing for far too long. After getting dressed, he went to the small wooden box he had opened the night before. His fingers hovered over the medals and ribbons inside. He wasn't sure if he should bring them, but something inside him told him that today was the right day. Carefully, he picked up a small medal, one of his oldest, and pinned it to his jacket. A knock on the door made him turn. He opened it to find Daniel standing there, dressed casually but neatly, with a warm smile on his face. "Morning, John," Daniel said. "Ready to go?" John nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." As they walked toward Daniel's car, John glanced at his old truck. The repairs were scheduled for the following week, something that still felt strange to him. He wasn't used to people offering help without expecting anything in return. But today, he wasn't going to dwell on that. The drive to the community center was quiet but comfortable. John stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, feeling a mix of emotions he hadn't expected. Nervousness, excitement, maybe even a little hope. When they arrived, John hesitated for just a moment before stepping out of the car. The building wasn't large, but it was welcoming. A small sign by the entrance read, "Veterans Gathering. All are welcome." Daniel led the way inside, and the moment they walked in, John felt something shift inside him. The room was filled with people, men and women, some old, some young, all with stories similar to his. Some sat in small groups, laughing and sharing memories. Others stood by a long table, pouring cups of coffee and chatting. John felt a brief moment of uncertainty. It had been years since he had been in a place like this. But before he could retreat, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Whitmore, you made it." John turned to see the young woman from the courtroom, the one who had mentioned the support group. She walked over with a bright smile. "It's good to see you here," she said warmly. John nodded, figured it was time. She gestured toward a group of older men sitting near the window. "Come, let me introduce you to some folks. I think you'll fit right in." John followed her, and as he approached, one of the men stood up, offering a firm handshake. "Name's Robert," the man said. Served in the Navy. You? John. Army, he replied, shaking Robert's hand. Robert grinned. Good to have another Army man around. Come, sit with us. John sat down, and soon the conversation flowed naturally. They shared stories, some about their service, others about life after. John listened, nodding, adding a few words here and there. The more he listened, the more he realized. These men understood him. They had walked the same path, felt the same struggles. For years, John had believed he was alone. But sitting here, among people who truly understood, he realized he had been wrong. Daniel watched from a distance, smiling to himself. He had hoped bringing John here would be good for him, but seeing it happen was something else entirely. After a while, John excused himself and stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. As he stood there, looking at the sky, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Daniel. You all right? Daniel asked. John nodded. Yeah, more than all right. Daniel leaned against the railing. I knew you'd fit in here. John chuckled softly. I wasn't sure at first, but I think I needed this. He glanced at Daniel. Thank you. Daniel smiled. You don't have to thank me, John. You've given so much to others. It's about time you got something back. John exhaled slowly. He had spent years believing his best days were behind him, that his sacrifices had been forgotten. But today proved otherwise. Today, he was reminded that he was still part of something bigger, that his story still mattered. And for the first time in years, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time.